While I was in Virginia, I had the lovely opportunity to meet with my professional religious colleagues there. Every state has some cluster of ministers. Some states also have a cluster of religious education professionals. And a few states like Virginia have a cluster where they've said, we don't need to separate ourselves so much. We are serving the same group of people. We are working together in combination and collaboration to support and love and hold our congregations, to provide opportunities that they might not have on their own. So let's not do that separate thing, let's do that together thing. And so in Virginia, it's religious education professionals and ministry professionals. They do take a few minutes, like half an hour, 40 minutes of every meeting, which is usually 3 or 4 hours long, to caucus, in their own little groups, because there are things that ministers have specific and there are things that religious educators have specifically to talk about. But most of the time is spent together. And I went with some trepidation because I was going to spill my guts. It's what ministers get to do with other ministers. Good ministers try not to do that with their congregations. Doing that, even among my colleagues, that I have known these people since I began on this journey, because this is the cluster that I was in when I was in formation as a minister. And they have, bless their hearts, let me drop in and drop out remotely and when I'm in town to their meetings all these many years, not so many, but years. And I am truly blessed. So I dropped in and we have a sharing time. It's not that I came to spill my guts, just because I was there, but we actually have a time for that. And we have a worship together, which is a wonderful thing because ministers rarely get a chance to be where you are, to just experience the worship. I mean, I get a lot out of being here with you, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the back of my mind, that I'm monitoring as I'm here. And when I am in a worship service with my colleagues where someone else is leading it, I'm just taking it all in. So before we had our sharing time, we had a worship time, and I want to share with you what the religious educator shared with us. An egg. An egg. This is not a hard-boiled egg. So once you hear the story and you think about it and you want to come and pet the egg, be gentle. If you want to steal the egg, do it in the little plastic cup, because truly this is not a boiled egg. In fact, I initially forgot it and had to turn around and go back and get it out of my refrigerator. So this is what the religious education professional said to us. She said, well, we're still in love, but I've moved ahead to vulnerability and everyone here decided they could come along with me. So here we are. And vulnerability made me think of an egg. How many here think of an egg as being fragile? Yep. How many here eat eggs? Okay. If I threw this egg at the wall, what would you expect? Right? But you know what an egg does, right? When it's fertilized, it grows a bird. When it's not fertilized, it holds the gooey substance of life, highly nutritious, sought after by about every other being. Just about every other mammal, other birds like to find eggs and eat eggs because of the nutritious gooey stuff in the middle, which has an ever so thin covering around it. Now, why would it be so thin, do you think? Exactly, because the little chick, if there is one, has to get out. So if the covering, which actually, looks pretty solid. If you didn't know it was an egg, if I had a gold color or you say black or green, you might think it was some kind of rock, right? But that little bird has to be able to get out of here. So it cracks fairly easily from the inside. It's actually stronger than you might think on the outside. It can take a fair amount of pressure. But it's only when the outside is cracked and what's inside, the vulnerable, gooey goodness can come out, or the new little life can come out. So while many of us have grown a shell around us a little bit, we don't share too much, we don't say too much, we don't do too much, just enough. But does anybody really know our gooey center? The real nutritious part, the part that gives rise to new life? I can't answer that for you. I can tell you in my own life, there are times when I am quite closed, quite protective, very covered by this little shell. And other times when I am so open, I cry at the drop of a hat. Not from sorrow necessarily, not even necessarily from joy, just from the knowledge of being alive and the possibilities and understanding the significance of the relationships that we build here. You remember my sermon on Rizpah and the community that supported her. It was about a woman in the Bible who spent months out in nature protecting the bodies of young men who had been killed in a political treaty, a political, agreement. And she was out there day and night, and I was thinking in my head, how can a person do that? Well, they can't do that unless they have a community that helps support them. Such has been the case in our own denomination, in Unitarian Universalism. We have had people who've been willing to be vulnerable, to, in a metaphorical sense, be like Rizpah and be open to the elements and uncertain as to what the next day was going to bring, and actually, in some cases, kind of give up their own agency so that they can be a mouthpiece for others. I want to bring your attention to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of our, well, some are forebears. There are a couple that are actually alive and well today, so I don't want to mischaracterize the whole list, but several of them are theological ancestors, and some are doing well. The first I'd like to bring your attention to is Judith Sargent Murray, who lived from 1751 to 1820. Her father had on spec built a church saying someone is going to come here and preach. And almost a decade later, somebody did. Judith Sargent Murray was a part of that family legacy. She was also a pioneering writer an advocate for women's rights, and a member of the first Universalist church in America built in 1780. Her essay on the equality of the sexes, published in 1790, asserted that women and men were spiritually and intellectually equals. You can imagine that might not have been so popular among some of her peers, some of her social friends, but she was willing to be vulnerable to personal attack, to criticism, and to rejection, social rejection, in order to become the mouthpiece, a very early mouthpiece for women's rights and equality. And by the way, what I love about this, and I'm going to go read that essay. I haven't read it yet, but the fact that she was not just talking about, let's say, voting rights or right to own property or something like that. She said spiritual and intellectual equals. There's an understanding that you don't have to say something if that's the norm. So she wouldn't have to say spiritual equals if there wasn't some significant thought out there that women were less spiritually capable, advanced, mature, just less. And Universalism was ahead of Unitarianism in having women as ministers. So I owe a lot to this woman I've never met, who put herself out there. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper is another woman. She was an African-American member of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia. She lived from 1825 to 1911. She's been called the most prominent African-American woman writer of her generation, and I don't know much about her. How is that possible? Maybe I should do a little more reading. I recommend to the groups that are doing book groups, maybe you should do a little more reading on her. Maybe you already know and I don't, but I'm thinking that Frances Ellen Watkins Harper isn't exactly a household name, you know. Her address to the 11th Women's Rights Convention in 1866. So by 1866, we'd already had 11 women's rights conventions, and she came and she implored what were a lot of mostly wealthy, privileged white women to include their African American sisters. That, I think, way back then was a recognition of intersectionality, and also a recognition that the way privileged white women experience being excluded is different than the way non-privileged minorities, in this case African American women, experience being left out. It's not the same experience. There's a thread of commonality for sure, but the details of that experience is very different. And so Frances Ellen Watkins Harper stood up, became vulnerable. Well, she was already vulnerable for being an African American in an already and always predominantly white denomination, and saying, hey, it's lovely what you're doing. We need what you're doing, but could you include our experience as well? And then there's the Reverend Joseph H. Jordan. I love this because you know how Jordan is spelled? Jordan. But it is pronounced Jordan. And the Reverend Joseph H. Jordan was the first Black person ordained a Universalist minister. He lived from 1842 to 1901. So, we're moving forward in time in my list. He launched a school for Black children in Norfolk, Virginia in 1887 that operated until 1906. It was part of a broader movement to support Black people through the Jim Crow era. Because at that time, almost anything associated with Black folks was not getting a lot of support from the establishment, the government establishment. So Black folks built their own communities, started their own businesses, created their own school systems, created their own churches. Some of that was pre-existing, but it fell on them to create their own communities because the predominantly white institutional communities weren't really giving them a fair share, weren't allowing them to participate. Well, there are two things about Reverend Joseph H. Jordan that I'd like to point out. One is that in 2019, the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism had a symposium named after Harper and Jordan in honor of them. And that the UU Religious Professionals Group in Virginia that I spoke about a little while ago, they recently renamed their cluster the Joseph Jordan Cluster. And a lot of us really weren't sure who that was. So we have some learning to do, I think, all of us, to get a more balanced view of our history and to really appreciate the vulnerable center of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist, and what it means to be the shell that protects those who are willing to be vulnerable, providing the container for those who need to speak out. I'm sure the next person I'm going to mention, there are only two more. The next person I'm going to mention, I bet you all know. And in fact, don't raise your hand up like this, but you could just do a little thing if this is something that someone you're familiar with. The Reverend James Reeb. Oh, not as many as I thought. Okay, we have some learning to do. I think I've just found maybe part of what the new minister series I'm getting ready to put together. I hope you'll come and join us. The Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister, came to Alabama from Boston. You probably know the story and don't remember the name. To march for civil rights in Selma. He died in a Birmingham hospital on March 11th, 1965, after being attacked by a group of white supremacists. Reverend Reeb was a social worker, Unitarian Universalist minister, and father of four. He answered the call for clergy to join in supporting the civil rights movement following Bloody Sunday. So now probably more of you have heard the story, but maybe just didn't put the name with the story. That's okay, happens to me all the time. If I look at you funny, it's because I'm not putting the name with the face. And finally, Julie and Hillary Goodridge were two of 7 UUs among the plaintiffs in Goodridge v. Department of Public Health, which was the case that brought marriage equality to Massachusetts in 2003 and paved the way for national marriage equality in 2015. On May 17, 2004, the Goodriches were among the first same-sex couples legally married in the United States in a ceremony officiated by then UUA President William G. Sinkford, himself a prominent African-American minister and social activist. He's currently serving as the interim minister for our flagship congregation in Washington, D.C., All Souls. Boy, those Unitarian Universalists, they're something, aren't they? They know all about the vulnerability of speaking truth to power. And I'm looking at a congregation of people who have taken for themselves various social justice issues and bring them to our attention regularly and go out into the community and work regularly. And you all know that you can do that, I think, in some part, because you know you have a congregation here of people who are committed like you are, will listen to you as you share your frustration with how the world is compared to how the world, I don't want to say ought or should, but yes, ought or should be. Right? We could be more loving, more compassionate. We could have more healthy institutions that care about the quality of life as opposed to simply productivity or profit. Boy, I sound so like socialist right now and have for a few days, but it's really because I think what's happened, it's not that I'm against free enterprise or making a profit. It's just that without any kind of regulation or balancing measure, right, we end up with people being treated as human resources, someone to do the job that makes the money or produces the thing. And I'd really like for us to be able to do the job, produce the thing, and still have a good quality of life. That would be really awesome. Because people who go out there for other people are vulnerable to losing jobs, to being ostracized, to having windows broken, and tires slashed. And for some of the people I've mentioned, you know, vulnerable to losing their lives. All I can say is that Unitarian Universalists are pretty darn good at being both vulnerable enough to get out there and speak their piece and work for the betterment of everyone, and holding each other in love and compassion. That's it. I'm just so happy to be a Unitarian Universalist and so blessed to be the minister of this congregation.